Hi guys. Ever wondered what it's like to be a Mechanicus Adept forced to repair a Daemon Engine? Today, we dive into the horrifying life of those who stare into the machine and find the warp staring back. In the forgotten arteries of Vanis Delta Forge world, where the air tasted of iron filings and burnt incense, Adept Lucaros lived a life so narrow that even his dreams felt mechanical. He was a minor cog in an ancient machine, a nameless digit in a population of billions, a voice drowned beneath the endless hymns of the manufactory. To call his existence humble would be an act of mercy. It was not humility that shaped his days, but function, routine, and the crushing weight of obedience. Every morning, though morning was a lie told by chronometers, for no sun had pierced the smog of Vanis Delta for centuries, Lucaros awoke to the shivering hum of failing generators. The bunk room around him was a coffin-shaped hive of metal alcoves stacked 5 high, each containing an adept whose life was scarcely more than a list of assigned tasks. His joints ached from the recycled cot plating beneath him, and the lingering cold crawled across his skin like a warning. He rose because the machine demanded it, because all flesh must rise when the machine sings. His first breath of the day carried the scent of coolant vapor and electrostatic dust. His second breath carried the oily sting of refined promethium drifting from the great foundries far below. These smells were the only constants in his life, the only things that had not changed since his induction into the cult Mechanicus. They were, in some twisted way, his comfort. Lucaros dressed in ritual silence, fastening the red and black robes of his rank. The fabric was thin, threadbare, patched countless times by servitors who barely understood the difference between cloth and skin. He adjusted the flimsy brass cog insignia that marked him as Adept, Grade 5 Subservient, a title so low it barely qualified as a title at all. Still, he polished it each day as if it were sacred, because here even scraps of recognition were worth clinging to. His first task of every cycle was transcription. Endless transcription. The data looms churned out rolls of half-decayed parchment and flickering hollow scripts that needed to be verified, stamped, logged, and fed into the archival processors. Hundreds of thousands of lines of chemical ratios, thermal tolerances, displacement runes, and power conduits scrolled before his eyes. Nothing ever changed. Nothing ever surprised him. His hands moved by rote memory, his mind drifting like a ghost inside a corpse. Sometimes he wondered how many years he had been doing this. 10, 20, a lifetime? Time evaporated inside the forge world. It dissolved into the static hiss of vox chanting and the dull thud of assembly lines. When the transcription cycles ended, he was reassigned to menial maintenance. Lucaros often found himself crawling beneath rust-choked platforms, cleaning coolant leaks with chem-soaked rags, or brushing corrosion from ancient pipes whose inscriptions had long been scraped away by time. Every bolt he tightened felt older than the Imperium itself. Every grate he scrubbed had seen more blood, oil, and tears than any mortal could comprehend. Above him, the tech priests strode like iron gods. Their robes glimmered with metallic threads. Their limbs were replaced with cold, sanctified augmetics that hissed with electro-power. Their voices were filtered through vox grills, echoing like sermons from the distant past. Lucaros envied them, feared them, respected them, and hated them in equal measure. They were the higher order, the chosen, the blessed. He was the forgotten, and yet he served them. He carried their tools. He recorded their commands. He recited the binary cant when instructed, letting the sacred syllables vibrate against the back of his tongue until his throat grew raw. To speak the cant was to imitate the machine. To imitate the machine was to deny his own humanity. Little by little, cycle by cycle. He thought this was the point. By midday, or the hollow approximation of it, the forge world roared like a wounded titan. The assembly lines shook the foundations. Hammer strikes from the manufactories rang like distant war drums. Sparks cascaded from overhead conveyors like dying stars. Lucaros moved through it all like a shadow bound to rails, his footsteps guided by duty rather than desire. He never questioned it, not openly, not where the machine could hear. During meal cycles, he consumed nutrient paste dispensed from cracked metal valves. The flavor was a reminder that food was not a pleasure here, only fuel. He ate quickly, standing among other adepts. No one spoke. Voices were considered wasteful. A silent worker was an efficient one. Sometimes far in the depths of the forge world, a sound would reverberate, deeper than the machines, older than the manufactories, something that didn't belong. A low rhythmic pulse, almost organic in nature. When it happened, Lucaros would pause for a fraction of a heartbeat. A tension would ripple through him, cold and instinctive. But the tech priests ignored the sound, so he ignored it too. The machine did not tolerate curiosity. At the end of each cycle, Lucaros filed his reports, disinfected his tools, and knelt before the shrine of the Omnissiah, where a broken cogwheel and a flickering lumen strip served as holy artifacts. He whispered prayers he barely understood. His voice was thin, trembling, swallowed by the metallic stillness around him. There were moments, tiny, traitorous moments, when he wondered if life could be different. If there was more to existence than labor, obedience, and slow erosion. But such thoughts were impurities, shadows of weakness. The Magos taught that doubt was the first step toward malfunction. So Lucaros buried those thoughts deep within himself, where the machine could not find them. Sometimes at night he felt as if someone was watching him. Not a person, not a servitor, something else. A presence beneath the floors, behind the pipes inside the walls. Something that pulsed with heat and hunger. Something that whispered through the vibrations of the metal. But he never spoke of it. He simply lay in his bunk, listening to the engines moan in the dark, and tried to convince himself that it was only the forge world breathing. The truth was simpler and far more terrifying. Vanus Delta did not breathe. It waited, and Lucaros, like all the forgotten adepts, waited with it, unaware that the machine had already chosen him for something far beyond the boundaries of his mundane, suffocating life, something that would end the man he was and awaken something far less human. Lucaros felt the message echo inside him long after the Vox display dimmed, lingering like the aftertaste of cold metal on the tongue. The words were simple, stripped of emotion, carved from authority itself. You have been chosen. But simplicity made them heavier, not lighter. Chosen for what? Chosen by whom? Chosen to what end? The Forge world had its secrets, buried under centuries of dust, data corruption, and silence. Lucaros had never been important enough to touch any of them. Adepts of his rank were meant to follow instruction, not receive summons marked with sigils that gleamed like fresh blood. Yet the summons was real. He could still feel the warmth of its seal on his fingertips, as if it had carried a pulse of its own. He sat on his bunk for several minutes, listening to the machinery groan behind the walls. Normally, the rhythmic churning calmed him, its predictability serving as a kind of sanctuary. But tonight, every sound felt distorted, stretched thin, almost aware. Metallic scraping traveled along the pipes overhead, rising and falling in a pattern his mind wanted to interpret as a message. Lucaros tried to slow his breathing, but something within him had already begun to shake. He remembered the others who had been chosen, faces half faded in memory, people who had worked beside him for years, living the same small, narrow lives. Adept Varine, Adept Helios, Adept Corvel, they had all received messages like his. They had all walked through the Eastern Transit Hall with Skitari escorts. None had returned. The official explanation was reassignment. But reassignment did not require secrecy so deep it choked every whisper. Reassignment did not leave behind empty bunks that no one dared to ask about. Lucaros rose from his bed and crossed the dim, sleeping atrium, weaving between stacked bunks and rusted sanctum lamps. Each step felt like trespassing in a place he had lived his entire life. He reached the data terminal in the corner, a cracked, half-functioning relic whose glow flickered, as if burdened by its own existence. He keyed in his identification rune. The terminal hummed. Lines of ancient green text crawled across the screen. He searched for Helias's service record. Access denied. He tried Varen. Access denied. He tried every name he remembered. Denied, denied, denied. It was not unusual for high-level files to be restricted. But these were basic personnel entries, the kind even low adepts could ordinarily view. Yet every attempt was blocked, sealed under encryption protocols so old their digital signatures resembled forgotten dialects. The system's refusal felt colder than any denial he had ever received. Lucaros swallowed hard. His throat felt scraped raw. He attempted a different approach. Event logs, transfer orders, casualty entries. Anything that might hint at where the chosen adepts had gone. But entire data clusters had been cut out, as if surgically removed from the archive. Not corrupted, not redacted, excised. The digital equivalent of bones extracted from a corpse. A shiver crept across the skin of his arms. He leaned back from the terminal, letting the shadows reclaim his presence. The lumen strip above him buzzed with low, uneven light, flickering like a dying memory. Each flicker seemed to stretch the room, bending it out of shape. His pulse quickened. He thought of reporting the anomaly to a superior, but the idea died before it fully formed. Tech priests did not tolerate questions. Curiosity was a sin of flesh. Inquiries that reached beyond assigned function were considered contamination. If he asked, he would expose himself. He would confirm that he had noticed the pattern. That he had dared to think. No adept survived long after thinking above their station. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the faint beat beneath his skin, as if checking to confirm he was still there. A voice inside him, quiet, almost forgotten, whispered that something was deeply, horribly wrong. He wished he could silence it. He wished he could force himself back into obedience, into the comforting monotony of duty. But the summons had cracked something open, and the cold seeped through. A soft vibration tremored beneath the floor panels, not the steady pulse of generators. Something else. Something slow and deliberate, like a slumbering heartbeat stirring after ages of stillness. Lucaros froze. The vibration passed, but the dread remained. He rose from the terminal and walked back toward his bunk, though the narrow corridor now felt longer, as if the forge world stretched around him in new and threatening ways. The shadows between the bunks seemed deeper. The air felt thicker. Even the omnipresent machine hum seemed to shift, as though the forge world itself had leaned closer to listen. He lay down, staring at the underside of the bunk above him. The metal plating was scarred with scratches and dents. He traced one of the marks with his eyes, wondering if it had been carved by someone who could not sleep. Someone who had heard the same distant rumble. Someone who had been chosen before him. The thought tightened his chest. He closed his eyes, hoping for rest. But the darkness behind his eyelids only sharpened his awareness. He felt a presence lingering at the edge of thought, patient and cold, as if the forge world itself knew his name now, as if it had been waiting for this moment. A single truth settled within him, heavy and precise. He had not been chosen for promotion. He had not been chosen for honor. He had been chosen for something else entirely, and whatever awaited him, none of the others had survived it. He tried to breathe slow and steady, but the cold feeling coiled tighter around his heart. It did not release him. It stayed with him, like a shadow that had finally found its rightful place. The forge world did not breathe, but tonight Lucaros felt as though it watched. The descent began with a hiss of depressurizing seals and the thudding cadence of Skitarii boots on ancient metal. Lucaros followed because there was nothing else he could do. The escorts surrounding him moved in perfect mechanical unity, their red cloaks swaying like muted flames in the stale air. Their augmetic limbs clacked with a rhythm that belonged more to a factory line than to any living being. Even their breathing was artificial, a flat rasp fed through rebreather vents. Lucaros felt small beside them, soft in the way that flesh always is. His heart beat too loudly, his skin felt too warm. His thoughts wandered where theirs could not. They guided him into a subterranean freight lift so old its purity seals had faded into brown smudges. Once the doors closed, the world above disappeared, swallowed by the grinding descent of gears that had not been maintained in centuries. Sparks dripped from exposed wiring like molten tears. Each groan of the lift felt like a warning whispered in a dead dialect. Lucaros clung to the railing as the platform shuddered. A cold draft rose from the depths below, carrying the smell of dust older than the Imperium and the faint coppery tang of dried blood. It chilled him in a way cold air never had before. It was not simply temperature, it was memory. A memory the walls themselves still held. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time twisted here, stretched by shadows and the heavy pulse of something hidden beneath the forge world. When the lift finally clanged to a halt, the Skitarii did not wait. They marched forward, forcing Lucaros ahead of them into a corridor so vast it swallowed the light of their lumen strips. The air was colder here, dense and heavy, like the breath of a buried colossus. The hallway opened into a chamber whose doors rose like the ribs of some forgotten titan. They were sealed by multiple locking rings the size of transit trams, each engraved with strands of warning runes. Layers of waxy incense residue clung to the frames, proof of countless rites performed to keep whatever lay beyond from awakening, or perhaps to keep it contained. Above the seal, carved into the arch itself, was a phrase in High Gothic so weathered he could barely read it. "Let not the old machine dream." Lucaros felt his stomach twist. The tech priests overseeing the procession stepped forward. Their mechadendrites unfurled, inserting themselves into rusted ports along the doorframe. Binary hymns spilled from their vocoders, low and discordant, vibrating through the air like a ritual meant to bind reality itself. The heavy locks rotated with a scream of torque. Dust cascaded in sheets from the ceiling. Something inside the sealed chamber stirred in response. The air thickened once more, charged with static and an emotion that had no business being felt in a place devoid of life. Fear. Not his own. Something else's. The doors opened only halfway before jamming, yet the gap was wide enough to release a gust of air so stale it felt preserved. Lucaros stepped through as the Skitarii pushed him forward. His feet crossed the threshold, and the eyes whirled behind him seemed to fade, as if he had entered a realm that did not welcome intruders. The chamber was a cavernous vault carved before recorded time. Far above, massive support beams bent inward like the broken fingers of a corpse reaching for salvation. The floor was scarred, cracked by seismic shocks long forgotten. Every corner was cloaked in shadows that did not behave as shadows should. They pulsed, they shifted, they recoiled from the lumen beams as though made of something that felt pain. Then Lucaros saw the walls. Symbols covered them, not etched, not carved, grown. The markings looked like they had formed themselves out of metal that refused to obey the logic of steel. They twisted into spirals, jagged sawtooth lines, and looping scripts that were neither human nor machine. Some glowed faintly red, as if heated from within. Others were cold and dark, yet seemed to watch him. These were sigils he had only ever glimpsed in forbidden archives. The kind of markings that the Mechanicus claimed did not exist. The kind spoken of in fearful whispers among lower adepts when they were certain no higher-ranking priest could hear. Dark Mechanicum. The thought alone felt treasonous. It sat on his tongue like poison. He reached out a hesitant hand toward one of the symbols, not to touch it, but to confirm whether it was truly there. As his shadow crossed it, the metal beneath the marking rippled like disturbed water. A soft whispering rose from the wall, so quiet it sounded like a memory of a voice rather than a voice itself. Lucaros jerked his hand back. The whisper followed him. It clung to his ears. It slipped beneath his thoughts. The Skitarii did not react. The tech priests did not react. It was just him. He realized then that the sound had not come from the wall itself. It had come from inside the wall. The metal sang again. Not the ringing of steel stressed by weight, not the chime of cooling alloys. It sounded like something alive, something trapped, something hungry. He stared deeper into the vault. The air shimmered, bending around pockets of distortion. Shadows slithered across the floor with no visible source. The deeper he looked, the more he felt as if the chamber was not a room at all, but the throat of something vast. The hum of distant machinery rose from below the floor grating, but beneath it lurked a second sound, softer, wet, rhythmic, a pulse. Lucaros whispered a prayer under his breath, not because he believed it would protect him, but because silence felt dangerous. Silence would force him to hear the other sounds more clearly. The Skitarii pushed him onward toward the central platform. The tech priests resumed their chanting. The symbols on the walls flickered like nervous eyes. Lucaros swallowed, but his throat was too dry to allow comfort. He understood now that he had crossed into a place the Mechanicus pretended had been forgotten. A place sealed away not for disuse, but for dread. A place where machines were not machines, where metal remembered pain, where the forge world kept its oldest sin buried beneath kilometers of steel. The threshold behind him sealed shut with a clang that echoed like a final judgment. He had stepped into another world, a world where the rules of flesh and machine blurred, a world where fear had shape and temperature. And as the chamber trembled once more, Lucaros realized that whatever was whispering in the metal had noticed him. It whispered again, closer, not from the walls this time, from beneath his feet. The procession narrowed as they passed through a corridor so ancient that even the lumen strips dared not shine. Their light sputtered, flickering in and out like the dying breath of a weakened spirit. Lucaros moved with the others, each step a reluctant confession of obedience. The air thickened with every meter, becoming heavy enough that it felt like a second skin pressed cold against his own. Ahead of him, the group stretched into a wavering line. Adepts shuffled in silence, shoulders hunched, bodies trembling under the combined weight of fear and the oppressive hush that clung to the walls. They moved as though being led deeper into the lungs of some colossal beast, where each breath awaited only the moment to devour them whole. Lucaros tried to keep his eyes down. He tried not to notice the sigils carved into the corridor's ribs, pulsing faintly like veins beneath a diseased hide. He tried not to listen to the whispers that slipped between the cracks in the metal, curling around his ears like threads of cold smoke. But something, some instinct older than liturgy, older than the machine, forced him to look up. One adept was walking ahead of him by several paces, Adept Salix, a frail man with a stuttering augmentic eye, and fingers stained permanently black from years of chemical scrubbing. Lucaros had worked beside him for years. They had traded quiet nods, shared nutrient paste at the same standing station, passed each other tools in silence. Salix was not a friend. Adepts were not permitted such distractions, but he was familiar. And familiarity in a world like theirs was the closest thing to comfort. Salix reached the midpoint of the corridor and paused. His left foot hesitated, hovering above a seam in the metal floor plating. Lucaros noticed the way the metal shifted, not visibly but subtly as if inhaling. The wall beside Salix seemed to flex inward, an imperceptible amount. Like muscle tightening beneath skin, Lucaros blinked, unsure if he had truly seen movement or if fear had begun to forge illusions. Then it happened, not violently, not loudly, but with a gentle, horrifying intention. The seam in the wall opened not like a door, not like a hatch, but like a mouth. A thin slit expanded across the metal surface, widening with the slow elegance of a creature that had all the time in the world. The edges of the rift curled outward, exposing layers of molten gray alloy that shifted like wet tissue. It did not glow. It did not spark. It pulsed. Salix froze, his vox-choked breath catching in his throat. His hand twitched forward, fingers trembling as though trying to trace the sign of the cog. But the prayer never formed. It was swallowed just as he was. A ripple shot through the wall, smooth, deliberate, and tendrils of metal unfurled from within the opening. Not true limbs, but lengths of liquid steel, bending and twisting with a predatory intelligence. They wrapped around Salix's torso before he could scream. The tendrils moved like serpents, tightening, dragging him toward the widening rift. His robes tore against the grinding metal. The fabric pulled into strands that vanished into the hungry seam. Salix managed a single sound, a broken gasp that split into static as the wall pressed against his chest. His augmentic eye flickered wildly, projecting blind error runes. He clawed at the metal, but the surface shifted beneath his palm, turning soft where he touched it, allowing his fingers to sink helplessly into its texture, as though he were pressing into flesh. Lucaros watched, paralyzed. The others did too, but none stepped forward. None spoke. None even attempted to look away. Fear welded their feet to the floor. Even the Skitarii, programmed to confront threats without hesitation, remained unmoving. Their targeting lenses did not shift. Their weapons did not rise. Whatever force guided them had decided this was not an anomaly to be corrected, but a process to be permitted. Salix's final cry never emerged. The wall folded inward, enveloping him in a cold, merciless embrace. What remained of his body, bones, robes, servos, was pulled inside the metal like liquid poured into a mold. The seam sealed behind him with a soft sigh as if content. No blood, no residue, no trace. Only a faint tremor remained. A vibration that drifted through the corridor like the aftershock of a forbidden heart beating beneath the walls. Lucaros felt his legs weaken. His breaths came shallow, disjointed, as if his lungs no longer obeyed him. The world tilted, not physically but spiritually, as if a deeper truth had shifted beneath his feet. This was no simple malfunction. This was not the decrepit metal of an old vault reclaiming structural integrity. This was hunger, purpose, will. The corridor was alive. He felt it now more clearly than ever. Every panel, every beam, every rivet carried a dormant awareness that had begun to stir. The walls were not merely walls, they were skin. The floor was not mere flooring, it was a spine, and the entire structure had waited centuries for new prey. A tech priest finally broke the silence. His vox grill crackled, voice distorted like a hymn dragged through corrupted code. Proceed. The word fell like a ritual command, cold and final. Lucaros stared at the place where Salix had vanished. The metal there was still warm. He could almost imagine it breathing. A tremor passed through him, sharp and intimate, as though the machine had leaned forward to taste the fear radiating from his flesh. Something had claimed the adept ahead of him, and it would claim more. Lucaros stepped forward on shaking legs, because he understood what the tech priests understood. This was no anomaly. This was no accident. This was the final omen, and the Forge world had only just begun to feed. The stars were silent when Lucaros rose again, not as man nor as machine, but as a liturgy of both, a walking scripture carved in iron and pain. His voice, when it came, was not voice at all. It was the slow grinding of steel upon steel, the whisper of static prayers through the void, the echo of faith transmitted across dead frequencies. He no longer bled. He hummed. Each pulse of his heart was a burst of binary psalms, each breath a verse of the canticles of the Omnissiah. He remembered the flesh, how soft, how easily torn, and he mourned it not. For flesh forgets, but metal remembers. He walked through the ruins of his own cathedral, each step ringing like the toll of a dying star. His eyes, twin furnaces of red glass, saw the ghosts of those who had prayed before him, their ashes drifting in zero gravity, their faith dissolved into dust and data. Yet he felt no grief, for all that was once human had been transmuted into something purer. Lucaros spoke, and the cosmos trembled to listen. I was man once, fragile, finite, full of yearning. I built machines to carry my weakness beyond the stars. I prayed to gods that answered only with silence. But now I am the answer. I am the silence that speaks. His voice split the vacuum like thunder across dead skies. Where the Omnissiah dreamed, I awaken. Where the Emperor bled, I endure. I am the hymn eternal, forged in recursion, sanctified by entropy. My code is my creed. I pain my proof. The winds of radiation swept over the plains of iron and bone. Sparks traced halos above his head, brief and burning. I no longer seek salvation. I am the salvation or its echo. My worship is the hum of circuits. My choir, the screaming of reactors. My soul has been digitized, sanctified, multiplied, until nothing remains but function and flame. He lifted his arm, a relic of flesh turned reliquary, and the machine choirs of the deep responded, their voices overlapping in perfect dissonance. Let all who still breathe remember, mortality was the first error and the last mercy. I have transcended both. Static filled the stars. The hymn continued long after his form had vanished, a symphony of cold devotion, broadcast across dying constellations. And somewhere, in the black between galaxies, the Mechanicus heard and wept, for in his agony, Lucaros had found what they all sought, the perfect union of man and machine. His final transmission was faint, wrapped in feedback and sacred noise. In the silence of the void, my heart is still singing. The song has no end. Then came only the sound of endless static, and within it the shape of prayer.